All right.
All right.
Because that's how we always. It's like
What?
two sumo wrestlers, getting ready. So
We are.
So ostensibly we're live, but
Good.
and I'm so happy to be here. But I would wish I was actually there. And
Well, I don't know. It's like 100.
As I sit there and look at your face.
Wait, I just lost you.
You're breaking up a little bit there.
I don't know what that is.
Okay.
I mean, I'm really clear.
So, yeah, I look clear to me, and so I hope that everybody else sees us maybe somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
And so I got Kate is watching over on her end, so she'll tell me if there's something on, and she'll probably come here and Gabe will fix stuff. So if anybody's watching and we suddenly cut out because we've had it happen a couple times today, we'll just reconnect and come back on. But I'm so happy to see you. I wish we were in person.
Yeah, me too.
And your sound is cutting out. And
it is?
I don't know what.
Oh, well,
it's just kind of like.
I'm on a MacBook, but I also have an iPad Pro. Would it be better on the iPad Pro?
I really don't know because I usually don't have this kind of problems. But because I don't know if it's on my side or your side. But are you hearing me clearly?
Yeah, I'm hearing you, and I look really clear, but you're a little fuzzy. You keep going. Your picture is a little fuzzy.
Well, maybe I am a little fuzzy.
Well, that's what I usually see.
So Kate says I look fuzzy, and I bathed today, so that's not the issue.
Sorry.
And we just did a switch, but and we have the good camera.
Yeah.
So hold on. What are you seeing? I'm talking to Kate.
Okay.
You're delayed and fuzzy.
Yeah, she says I'm delayed and fuzzy. I'm seeing you.
So what's new?
Yeah.
So what's new?
And so this is like deja vu.
Right.
But all right. So let's see what's going on. But in the meantime, I'm hungry.
Yeah, me too. I'm hungry.
So what we've been doing for anybody who has not been watching or is watching or is going to watch on an archive version of this is typically it's like we're at home or we're at a restaurant or something like that, and we talk about our food for a little bit because that's what we do.
Okay.
Then we just talk. So you want to talk about your food or something?
Well, yours is probably more interesting, but I could talk about mine first because yours is probably more interesting. This is just, well, here, I'm moving my computer. Where are you? Yeah, you're there. I just have some pears and fresh mozzarella that are drizzled with honey and balsamic and black pepper. And then this is pasta alla griscia, which is just, it's pasta with chicken with pork jowl, and that's pretty much it. It's really hot here.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, it's like 115 degrees here right now. And so I didn't feel like really spending a lot of time in the kitchen. So this is a really fast dish, but I did make the pasta myself too. So
okay,
I made it from the recipe.
Well, that's what because
it's our family pasta recipe, which was from my great grandfather. It's the one he took to China with him. It's the one he gave to Marco Polo. He traded it for a hat.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're so indebted to your family. So yeah, so we call that pasta al Siciliano in China.
Yeah.
Pretty much when we all got diabetes,
right.
We all moved to Indonesia to get away from your family's pasta.
Yeah.
And so now we're here. So what you probably don't think of as really exotic. You make your own pasta, and you, as long as I've known you, you use like really incredible ingredients and stuff. But those pears look so great.
Yeah, they look really good. You know,
And
the thing that people
we,
the thing about Italian food is that it's all about a few ingredients. Like usually, if you're using more than maybe four things, you're wrong. You're doing it wrong. You know, like people always goop up Italian food with all kinds of spices and different things, and that's not real Italian food. Italian food is about the taste of the food. So, yeah. There's a
that's Indonesian food.
Yeah, you guys use a lot of spice, but you use them interesting, like an interesting combination.
Oh, yeah. So like what I'm eating, I'm gonna hold my plate up because I don't dare touch the camera. So what I'm eating here is basically is a curry, but it's a beef curry instead of lamb, and so I've replaced the ingredients, but the spice profile has about 20 spices in it. So Indonesian food believes in like wretched excess with everything. So we have something sweet, something sour, something hot, something bitter, something fried, something steamed, and so we fuss with our food. And so what I've done today is I've replaced the lamb shank with beef shanks. So it's like ossobuco. And then I've replaced the rice with cauliflower and the chickpeas with cannelloni. And so basically what I've done is I've appropriated Italian ingredients and made Indonesian food.
That sounds beautiful.
I just love any kind of shank meat. Basically, it's a curry. And people use curry like it's one thing, but in Indonesian curries, there's like thousands of them.
Right.
But so
well, I think it's the same with all curry. Yeah, all curry. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's just that, because you don't walk around carrying like 100 spices in a spice rack. Typically, your family will have one bag of mixed spices, and then when you fry it, it does one thing, and when you put it in onions, it does another thing. When you boil it, it does another thing, and profile just changes by bringing out different like oil solubility, heat solubility. So one thing can taste like a lot of different things. So,
well, there's a quote. The quote I love, like my cook goddess Marcella Hazan, you know, and her. I love the way she cooks, and she cooks like that. But she said one time, somebody came into her kitchen and said, "Where are all your spices?" And she said, "Well, one is there and one is there." She said, "That's it," you know, because Italians, I mean, we don't use spice like you guys use spice, you know.
Yeah.
Why is that? Do you think? Do you think we just?
I think that
foods.
Yeah, I think that part of like Indonesian cooking is not a homogenous society. So we have 1,000 years of India and 500 years of the Arabs and the Chinese, and it's like American. There's no such thing as an Indonesian. It's just it's a very non-homogeneous society, and so the underlying religions and stuff that we have is that when you eat, you have to honor the ancestors of everybody at your table. And so you would eat something of each flavor, each whatever. But I mean, Columbus came to the New World looking for Indonesian spices. He was coming to my grandmother's island from the other side. And so so this does not have mace in it, but that would have been the spice they were looking for. But it has everything else, and so typically all of the spice road spices got less and less and less until it got in Sicilian food. You see a lot more Moroccan and Egyptian and Levant spices and stuff like that. And then the further north you go,
Yeah.
the more it comes.
I've become more, as I've gotten older, I've become more and more interested in Sicily and my Sicilian side. I'm actually writing a lot about it right now. You know, it's an interesting culture because we face 3 continents, Sicily. We face Europe, Africa, and Asia. And we are right in the middle of the trade routes of those 3 continents. So it's interesting because anybody who wanted to trade basically had to control Sicily. And so we were always under the influence, the indigenous Sicilians were always under the influence of a more powerful culture. That's just been who we are. And I think it's interesting that how we developed like that. Like I was talking about today with my nephew about the difference between my father's father and my other grandparents, because my father's father, all 3 of my mother's father, my mother's mother, and my father's mother all came from the same little village, Carlentini, but it was a coastal village. My grandfather, my father's father, came from Calascibetta, which is an Arabic village, and that's right on the interior. It's Vicina Etna. It's like right here. It's right near Mount Etna. So the thing is, they were very different kinds of people. I mean, the people on the coast, people like from Messina, Palermo, are very different from the people of Etna, even though it's a tiny island, you know? But I think there's a difference between the people on the coast, I think, were easier to adapt. The people on the interior were more likely to build walls, you know, to try to keep people out. I don't know. It's just an interesting thing.
Well, the Dutch side of my family are called Dark Dutch, which means that they're really Sinti or Roma people, and that the where they settled. So Turks are probably watching here. The terps, the higher flat ground, where horse raising happened, and so like Lipizzaner and Gitane horses and military horses were typically bred and raised and trained by the gypsies, and so dark people who come from the Terps or from the Black Forest or in that area typically were Sinti or Roma people, and our people, the Dark Dutch, came through Sicily, and so we came straight from Pakistan and India, went from Sicily and then up through France and then into the Netherlands. And they changed and bred and along the way. So Kate and I are writing a lot about that now, just because of how the word gypsy, which people don't like, refers to a Catholic idea called the Egyptian heresies, which meant that you worshipped somebody other than God, and also that you worshipped what they thought of as Isis worship. But all of those different cultures had different things. So if you like in France, in the Camargue, you venerate Sarah Lakali. And so we did up there too, and they do in Paris, but under different names. So Sarah Lakali would be Saraswati, Lakshmi, and Kali, the 3 Hindu, the Tridevi combined. So all of that relates to our food. So my grandfather and my great-grandfather were called Dark Dutch, and so they were kind of swarthy looking. And so now we know that they're gypsies. So and a lot of we don't mind the word gypsies, but a lot of gypsies do mind the word gypsies. Dark Dutch is just a way of passing. So, but again, as you move further north, away from the spice routes, the food becomes simpler and simpler and simpler. My mom Um, her father loved eating what they call stampot, which is basically potatoes, carrots, onions, and um, fat back or pig jowls or or pork belly, um, all steamed boiled in one bowl, and that was it. And even when they moved into Indonesia and lived there for a few hundred years, that's what they thought food was. They did not eat the food of the people there. They ate stump.
It's
So
interesting.
my mom was.
I was going to say the Italians, I think another mistake people make about Italian cooking is being rigid about it, because Italian cuisine is not French cuisine. It's not about rules. It's about improvisation. So like the battle you always get into is people say, oh, pineapple on pizza. That's the big battle you always get. And I always think no Italian would ever tell you not to put pineapple on pizza. If you have delicious pineapple and you want to you like it, put it on whatever you want. That's the way we are. There are really, people make up these rules, but I don't think they're Italians they're not the same type of thing. It's different. A lot of what happened with sauce, tomato sauce here in the United States, was Italians trying to improvise and to recreate the taste of European tomatoes, which is very different. They're a sweeter tomato. So we always talk about how the difference in sauce here is sugar. Like, people are always trying to balance the sugar in the sauce. I almost never use sugar. If I have tomatoes that are really too acidic and I want them to be a little bit sweeter, I might add carrot, to the sauce, but I never put sugar in my sauce. A lot of people do. Like most of the East Coast, Napolitan, they use sugar in their sauce. Yeah. But I think it's not about the sugar, it's about the tomato, so.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, like if you eat what I'm eating and you put tomato in it, then all of a sudden it's tagine, and so the spices are very close to Hanu or Maruzia curries, but tomato becomes the difference. And so I made tagine last week when I was with Fred and Teresa. And that's a totally different thing. But again, the difference is tomatoes, and tomatoes are not indigenous to Indonesia or Europe. They're distinctly American. So the slave trade brought tomatoes, and tomatoes become really important because of sauce. Like, so when we talk about sauce, we say ketchup, and ketchup means any fruit sauce. So plum sauce, ketchup. But because tomatoes could be preserved, tomato ketchup becomes what sailors eat in order to not get scurvy. And it could be, you didn't have to refrigerate it. It just was essentially vinegar and tomato and then sugar. So, but they would add the sugar later. But what we think of as tomato ketchup is thought of as medicinal. You put this stuff on because you don't want to get scurvy.
Interesting.
But you will see that I will make everything Indonesian if I can, including like Sikorsky helicopters and stuff. But the part of it is that the confluence of all of these cultures, American imports, and African slavery and textiles, and what the Nigerians call Dutch cloth is actually teak from Indonesia. And so all of these things, these triangles that you look at in like the diaspora, like in the Gulf, also happened on the other side. And so Indonesia was that other place where confluence was. So a lot of the foods that like I love North Carolina, like Geechee and Gullah food. And it has lots of spices because all the spices from Indonesia came up through Suriname, and so there's a huge amount of Indonesian and India spices that are found in the African foods in American culture, and vice versa. When I make different dishes and stuff, it will have potatoes and carrots and tomatoes and peanuts. That's a huge Indonesian food, which are all distinctly American foods. So it's like we're all appropriating food, but it's like the history of the world and the history of slavery is in the history of food. And I think my own family is like that too. So tell us what you're drinking there. And
you know what's interesting too. This I was thinking about last week. I posted a little bit about it, but my mother used to make pasta sauce. She would make a sauce, and she would use spare ribs in the sauce, and it makes a really delicious sauce, spare ribs. But the thing is, I started looking into it, and I was talking to my brothers and sisters, and there are almost no recipes, Italian recipes, for ribs. Now, if you look at Southern cooking is really all about ribs. That's the quintessential Southern dish is ribs.
Right.
It's the one that unifies the South, But Italians really do not use them like that. I think that's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I could find 2 recipes.
Right, but was she a bone cooker? Did she cook neck bones and that kind of stuff?
But
because
the other thing we didn't
the flavor in the mouthfeel.
Yeah, but the other thing we didn't do that's interesting is you see all these recipes now, and they talk about browning the meats first. We never did that. We never browned meats first, and especially meatballs. We didn't brown meatballs; they just went right in the sauce, And I much prefer them like that. They're softer. They don't get that crust on the outside, and they absorb more of the sauce.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So,
I have a feeling that so much of we think of as cooking has to do with technology, and so like this idea of having multiple processes to make a dish, it's not as authentic as the Instapot. Throwing everything into the pot and doing it. Who had time for any of that? And also, I think that the appropriation of French culture that puts a template on all other cooking. I'm writing about last week. We're writing about Creole and Cajun, and all of these ideas around the Holy Trinity and mirepoix and everything are distinctly French. But when you look at the Africans and those influences of all of those cooking, that's a Frenchification of indigenous cooking.
Yeah.
And so now we think of that as what Creole is, or what Cajun is. But that's a French cooking style that's based on the technology of what they had at the time, but not really authentic. Those recipes and things are a lot of what we think of Cajun and Creole is from Prud'homme in the 1970s. And so you look at the recipes and stuff from the 1800s, and they're not like that at all.
Right.
So
I mean,
even things like
yeah. I mean, there's a certain, all of these things influence everything else. It's like you look at a lot of Asian cultures; they have an enormous street food culture, and that's because a lot of the homes didn't have kitchens. Yeah. So you had to work in the street. Like in Italy, we do have a baking culture. Asians don't have a baking culture. Very few homes have ovens. They have everything is done on a stove. Yeah. So there's almost no baking culture. But like even in Italy, you generally in the villages, individual homes didn't have ovens. You had a village oven, and there was one oven for the village. And that that's an interesting culture too. I mean, all of this is, it all falls in with each other. But the thing I always think about, like whenever you're talking about thought or modes of thought, worldwide modes of thought in anything, it's like anytime you get a thought, you can pretty much bet that at the moment that you got it, that there are 10,000 people worldwide who just got that same thought. I mean, we just have, it happens that way, And so it's a matter of how much thought happens simultaneously, how often, and that's
Right.
we all get the same influences, basically. It's interesting. Yeah.
I think that because a lot of what we're talking about, cultures did not have recipe books. They did not have literacy. They did not have all of these tools that we have.
Right.
And we also didn't have any ability to communicate. So in the same way, like, so I'm a Vodasante. I'm a conchante of Haitian Vodun. But what that means in a religious sense is a conchante in one village can be doing an entirely different thing than one in the next village. And so they might be calling themselves voodoo, or they might be calling themselves Guinea Yoruba. But there was no Bible, there was no rules. It simply was whoever was gathered together, all of the different slaves, anybody who remembered anything from their culture, those things were put together. And so voodoo means your gods. And it's that same approach again, though. It's like there isn't a homogenization or a religionizing of it. It's based on what's available locally, what's the issue, and who the enemy is. And so before it all became homogenized in the late 1800s and in the early 1900s, when you said voodoo or when you said Indian doctor, you meant any number of things that had been hybridized and wouldn't become one thing until much, much later. And so,
Right.
and in Haiti, it's still that way. Yeah. But here we say voodoo. But like this is Dr. John, and Dr. John is the famous New Orleans voodoo doctor. But he didn't practice voodoo. He spoke French. He was owned by a Frenchman, and he was Senegalese. He was a Mandinka, and he was much more religious-wise practicing Islam. So his people had been influenced by Muslims, and so he had a beard like the Muslim Africans. He also practiced Grigri, which is a distinctly Mandinka thing, and practiced astrology. So the Dogon people are Mandinka. And so they had really intense astrology and intense astronomy. And so what he called voodoo is typically totally unlike what we think of like Marie Laveau, who is the quintessential voodoo queen. But she was also creating a mashup of all of the different things. And so, and both of them freely admitted that when white people came in, that they just made shit up in order to just sort of whatever the need was, whatever the money thing was, that they had one thing that they told one group of people and one thing themselves.
You always see that, Ted, and you see it in every culture. Like we talked about ayahuasca, right? Like right now, the number of charlatans in ayahuasca are huge.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's kind of like, I don't trust anybody. I don't believe anybody who calls themselves a shaman. I have a problem with right off, because I'm thinking, I sort of, and I know it's partially because I'm Italian, okay, and I'm old, so I'm cynical, but it's like, I kind of think, there's a saying that says anything that you can understand probably isn't worth knowing. And that's, sometimes I think that's true. I think anybody who comes to you and says, I understand this, they might understand this, but I'm not sure that this is even worth worrying about. It's like, when we talk about in ayahuasca, I always think the teacher is the medicine. And the best thing you can do is remove any ego from the medicine. Remove your ideas, your suppositions of life, your idea of the universe, and anybody else. If somebody is sitting there telling you what you should do, it isn't a correct experience to me, to me, the experience is wherever you're going to go with it, and it doesn't have anything to do with anybody else in the room, and it doesn't have anything to do with you. It has to do with the road.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I'm kind of feeling. But the thing is,
I think that
all religions, they all do it, all the way through. They may, it may not. There is a certain, because the power becomes involved, and anytime power becomes involved, there's corruption. I mean, like even when people talk about the Dalai Lama, they'll go, "Oh, he's such a holy figure," and I'm thinking they lived like kings, and the peasants are the ones who allowed that. Like the Dalai Lama lives in a plaza, in silk robes. Who's paying for that? Somebody's paying for that. It's just the Vatican with your head shaved. I don't trust any of it anymore.
That's pretty much how I feel about myself. I am the Vatican with my head shaved. Yeah. And so, if I look inscrutable, people listen to me. Well, I think that what we're talking about, though, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
With my head shaved. So, the thing about it is that we're talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh, well, thank you. No. So do you. I'm really enjoying the whole hair thing, anyway.
It's me surrendering.
But what we're talking about with food, and we're talking about with culture and everything, is largely based on this idea of trying to homogenize and religionize and to orthodoxize everything. And indigenous cultures don't do that. They don't believe that. When we've talked about the Lakota people before, and their concept of religion and God is Wakan, which means it's unknowable.
Yeah.
And so Wakantanka, it means like infinite mystery. And in the African culture, religion and God and love are all called Awo, which means unknowable. And so that the whole thing is way more personal and way more fluid and way more everything. So there are no orthodoxies, there are no religions, no Ten Commandments, no Pope. The whole idea of shamanism is when patriarchal cultures came in, they started creating this nexus between your experience and God. But ayahuasca is a perfect example of a shamanistic culture that doesn't have an intercessor. So people who call themselves ayahuasqueros, when I did it like Peru, nobody leads that. You have a group of women singing and a guy administering, but your experience is your experience, and you're really paying people to clean your shit when you shit yourself, to like when you barf all over everything, and when you finally get to your experience, they just watch you, and then they don't. When I've done it in the West, I did it in Santa Fe and in Arizona, everybody processes afterwards. And so when they go down to like Peru or Argentina or someplace like that, nobody processes it. It's like, you need to sit on this for 6 days. And so in 5 days, we're saying goodbye to you. Mm-hmm. And you spend the next 4 or 5 days just with yourself. And nobody gets to trade notes, and nobody gets to, And so the Shipiba singers look at it as if you look at their cloth, they look at it as a map, and they sense where you are on the map. And all they're doing is saying, are you in trouble? Are you not in trouble? Are you having an experience? Are you not having an experience? And they just sort of modulate the tone of the thing simply by being there and seeing. But there is no religionization of it. There is no orthodoxy, and they look at it as if it's a being.
It's
that being talks.
A being.
It's a being. Yeah, and nobody. It's like when you experience ayahuasca and chacruna and datura, all those things, they think of them as different plant medicines that are all talking to you, and it's nobody's business what they're saying to you. and they don't care about what your issues were coming in. They just know that Westerners are more fucked up than other people and need more, you know. But uh, just like there are people who cook with recipes and are adamant about what's the right way to cook ribs, you know, and what's the best pizza and all of that sort of stuff. Um, we're recovering Christians, you know. We're always not just Christians, but Hellenists and legalists, monotheists, and that our own literacy has created this orthodoxy. And so we think if it's written down, it must be true. If it's in a recipe, that's the way to do it. But my mom never cooked with recipes, and I think that spiritually, that's how, you know, that's how I feel. You know? So, like, I would bet that if you talked about your ayahuasca experience and I talked about mine, they would be very, very different. And that's not what people want or expect. They think that there is an attainment that you have to get to. You know, like, have I leveled up? You know, it's not like it's not like a video game. And in that sense, it's like what you were talking about with food originally. It's like, this is where I am. This is what's fresh. This is what I need. This is what my experience is. This is what the ancestors said food was, and this is what I'm going to do with it right now. And so that's like when we talk about euphemistically, like living in the moment. Other cultures and our own cultures, before we Christianized, before we technologized them, were like that. They were much more in the moment and morphing into all kinds of different things all over the world. There was
And it
no
really,
like
you're not
universal Italian food. There was
right. But you're not saying that like indigenous people have it all right and Western people have it wrong. Is that what you're saying? No, I didn't think so.
No, I'm saying that I'm saying indigenous people don't have a right or wrong. That what they're doing is fluid.
See,
What they're doing is morphing all the time.
Well, but this is where I disagree with you. I think because I think indigenous people could be as corrupt as not as I think humans are humans.
I agree.
I think they are.
Yeah.
So like, you know, if you see what happened in like Aztec and Inca cultures, they were horrific. You know, they became horrific. And even Native American cultures, like you know who I really respect of all of the Native Americans is Crazy Horse, because Crazy Horse is the one who wouldn't accept any titles. He wasn't a chief. He wasn't a medicine man. He didn't want any titles. He didn't expect to be anything other than another person pulling their weight. That's all he ever was, you know? Right. And I really respect that. I think that's cool. But if you look at somebody like, you know, we look at Sitting Bull. You know, Sitting Bull joined the Wild West show because he liked nice things. You know, he liked buying stuff. You know, he was just like everybody else. A lot of those people became like that very quickly, and some didn't. You know, some didn't. But
I think that that's a really, really good example of, because what you're talking about is not sort of an indigenous culture, because by the time the Aztecs and the Incans and the Mayans went through their period of time, was almost the exact same time that the Egyptians and the Chinese and the Europeans were all becoming monotheistic. And so Egyptians go from pantheism to the one and only Ra, and in the Mayan cultures that have amazingly similar mythologies to African and Asian cultures. At the same time, they're all becoming what we just talked about. They're becoming monotheistic, they're becoming literate, they're becoming building cultures. The Mayan have a Tower of Babel story that's just like, they call it the Tower of Tea, but it's their story of the fall, you know, like the second fall. And when they talk about entering into the next world or the third world at that point, they're talking about becoming patriarchal and monotheistic and killing and savage. And so to me, that is it may be indigenous in the sense of they live there, but it's not indigenous in the sense of what the original cultures practiced. You know, that the Lakota were not a religious people, that the Sioux cultures all practiced a form of ancestral veneration that was different all over the world. I mean, so the Plains Indians, like the ones we talk about with Crazy Horse, they did not have chiefs, and they did not have shaman. They did not have Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and American Horse were called the shirt wearers. And so every 5 years or every 4 years, they would get together and they would all elect somebody who simply they believed reflected the best in all of them as a whole people. So 6, 7, or 8 different bands and tribes would get together and do this every 4 or 5 years. So Sitting Bull becomes a shirt wearer. American Horse is a shirt wearer. Crazy Horse is a shirt wearer. And they're the last 3 people to have that title. Sitting Bull then becomes at this place where American culture is saying, who's your chief? So you come into a tribe and you say, who's your chief? And they don't have any concept of that. And so the Lakota people would point to the women or point to the grandmothers, and they're like, no, who's your chief? You know, who's the man in charge? And so eventually they would say, well, that's Crazy Horse. And Crazy Horse would say, no, I'm just the shirt wearer. So at the same time, like in the Black Hills in the 1800s, because I'm really fascinated by Deadwood, you know, in Deadwood in the 1870s, Sitting Bull has his camp right outside. Mystic, South Dakota is Sitting Bull's camp. And so Custer is there. And Custer is there not as a representative of the Army. He's there because he's been hired by Abner Doubleday, who is there with the Spalding Company. And so they're there selling baseball, you know. But Custer at the same time is thinking about trying to regroup, you know, in bringing parts of the Army together after the Civil War. And so he's interested in that because there are a lot of men there, and there's also a lot of money there now. So what Sitting Bull experiences is a different thing, is that he knew Custer, and he was hanging out in Deadwood, and he was part of that culture at the same time, and was because there were so many. There was prostitution, and there was opium, and there was all of that stuff, and there were also who wanted to have a guru, and so he was happy to take money for that, and so American Horse tried to get his shirt removed, and tried to get the Oyate to say he's no longer a shirt wearer because he's become Wasichu. He's become a fat eater. And so they saw him becoming westernized as part of no longer being part of the culture. But he was never a chief. He was never the mystic. He was never the shaman. He was never, you know. So they didn't have medicine men. Medicine was not a job at that time. It typically was something that happened to somebody. If you had a trauma, or if you had that if you healed, you became a medicine man. And it wasn't really that much of an honor. It was something that you had to do. It was just like it was something that you had to do to yourself, and to also have a usefulness in the society.
It's interesting. I mean, you know, I'm a huge Custer buff, and I think he's one of the most misunderstood figures in American history. I think he was very different than everybody thinks he was, you know, and we have this idea of him based from, you know, the dime novels. It's the same thing with Billy the Kid, you know. I think I wrote this the other day. I don't remember where I wrote it, but I was talking about how America was really started as a business venture, and And like a good business venture, we're very good at marketing, but we've also got an entire populace that is very susceptible to marketing. And so our history becomes a PR campaign, by whoever is writing it at the moment, But I'm very interested in this now because, like, we're basically talking about corruption within a culture, corruption within a system, because all of these systems started out with the right idea for the most part. They always do, right? And then things happen, and like I'm fascinated by this right now because I'm seeing it right now. This what's going on right now politically in this country is astonishing to me. I mean, it's astonishing to that. And I hate to even talk about it right now because I got to tell you, this is something else. That's the amount of time that we spend on this. Like at the last journey I went to, it was all we talked about. All we talked about was today's political situation. And I said, what's interesting about it is that if I think that Trump is the most corrupt president we've ever had, and I think he is, I think probably the most decent human we've ever had as a president is Barack Obama. This is a really admirable human, right? But the thing is, when I began doing Journeys 7 years ago, Obama was president. We never talked about it. We never talked about politics there. But now it consumes us. It's all we speak of, And like just the other night, it was interesting. I don't think they'll mind my talking about this, but like Katie, Dreer, and Jason, they watched Big Night for the first time, right? And they didn't like it. And they didn't like it because they were aware of the fact that this was about the dream of immigrants and how what's going on now, and how that's become a different thing. And I thought, my God, well, I guess all art should be viewed. This is kind of why, like, I kind of agree with Kafka when he wanted all of his stuff burned when he died, because I'm kind of thinking if you're an artist who really cares about the relevance of your art, then you should burn it when you die, because it's never going to mean the same thing after it leaves your hand. It's never going to. You shouldn't show it to anybody. First of all, you shouldn't show it to anybody. You should write it and just keep it to yourself. But the thing is, especially now, everything is being distorted into different lenses, And I'm wondering, like, what will, like, I'm worried about 50 years from now. It's like right now we've got a whole group of students, right? What is going on with orchestras and choirs now? How are they existing now? Where are the choral and orchestra musicians? It's like when you look at a guy like Billy Vitz, he's sitting home right now. I mean, Billy Vitz is probably one of the greatest percussionists in the United States today. And he's sitting home. He's going to have years that he would have been creative at art that are not going to be there, and that's an incredible. I mean, if you're looking at this, not geographically, rocks geologically, this is a big ugly, this is a big ugly thing in the strata, this is a big ugly mark in the strata, and it's not going to be 6 months. I mean, I think everybody's thinking, November he'll be voted out. It's going to be okay. It's not. We are forever marked by this. We are forever marked by what has happened.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult time right now.
I think that because I look at it geologically, so I'm a paleontologist, and so when we look at what's going on, everything that I see with us is to me like the dinosaurs. So like 63 million years ago, the dinosaurs were getting to this point of what evolutionary biology calls gigantism. They became so incredibly successful that they grew and grew and grew and grew, and they became giant, and then they became susceptible to all of the things that smaller things are not susceptible to. You say, well, what killed the dinosaurs? Well, for a million years, it was a virus here, a volcano there. They were eating their own food supply. They were, they were like cows. They were farting. They were creating so much methane. All kinds of different things. So there wasn't an extinction event, but there was an extinction event we can see. So geologically speaking, we look at what's called the KT boundary. And so it's this thin little white stripe in the earth that that marks where the meteor over in Belize by Chicxulub. And so that released huge amounts of white filmy stuff into the air, covered the earth for months, settled. And so they call that boundary the difference between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary. And that's the extinction event we look at. So I look at Trump that way. He's our KT boundary because that's what we can see. But all of our extinction was really happening millions of years before that. So what's happening now is only being brought out by something that extreme, as well as he really is the last. He is a gigantic. He's like what is no longer sustainable. So after this layer, when we go into the next period, there will be new everything.
Yeah.
So a guy like Billy is a good example. Is as much as he has changed in our view of what art and culture is, his relevance to us is he belongs to the symphony and he can record and he can. So there's a monetization of his art that we appreciate about him. And we think about him in terms of his usefulness to our needs, when that may not be the definition, but in the middle of an extinction event, there is a huge amount of collateral damage.
Yeah.
So a lot of the most successful dinosaurs simply died because everybody else was dying. No matter how good they were, no matter how sustainable they were living. At the same time, when you look at who did survive, the little tiny mammals that were us, came about that. But at the same time, all birds were dinosaurs. So there is no Billy Vitz dinosaur existing anymore, but something in who he is, something in the DNA of what he does, is going to survive.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we're not the generation that gets to see that because evolution doesn't move that fast. So we're probably going to spend the next 5 years trying to figure out what this means to us personally. But what it really means on a big scale, on a grand scale, on an art scale, I don't think we can know. It's like that ayahuasca experience. It's like we're just not going to know.
Yeah.
And we just have to keep doing what we do and hope that 7 generations from now, they figured it out.
Yeah. I mean, I know
might not, because this
Yeah.
event,
Yeah, I mean, things change and they have to change, and that I'm not upset about that. It's just interesting how they change, how things change. I mean, like I remember in the 80s and 90s, like if you wanted your kid to have a steady job at that point, they were saying put them on double bass, on the big double bass, because at that point in time, when America was buying compact cars, nobody had their kid on double bass. There was a whole generation that didn't produce double bass players, and it was purely because the parents couldn't drive them to and from rehearsal. That was the real reason for it. So what happens then? So like you look at it and you say, okay, there's a dearth of double bass players, right? So or there's an absence of double bass players, right? So do composers stop writing for them? Do we start using alternatives? Are we, for that sound, all that kind of thing? I mean, it's so interesting how everything affects everything else. And this is what I think about with this. It's like also we don't tend to see history, we especially nowadays, we don't see history as it really is. I mean, like everybody says, oh, Trump is a reaction to Barack Obama. No, he's not. Trump is a reaction to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, was a reaction
Right,
to probably
right.
James Madison. I mean, the thing is, like,
Right.
history doesn't happen in 2 years or 3 years or 8 years or 10 years. History happens in 200 years or 300 years or 500 years, I mean, I think Trump will be completely insignificant in another 5 years. He's going to be nothing. It'll be a punchline. That's what it's going to be. But
Yeah.
the effects of
In an
him,
orange jumpsuit.
what?
Yeah.
What did you say?
I said in an orange jumpsuit. Yeah.
Hopefully.
Hopefully he'll be in an orange jumpsuit in 5
Hopefully.
years from now.
The remake of Angels with Dirty Faces would be great. Yeah. Look at me now, Mom.
I think in the same way, all we think about are Rexes. Like if you have an immature view of dinosaurs, all you can think about is the T-Rex, and and he is that. He's like the terrible lizard.
Yeah.
But the truth is that when you think about like T-Rexes from a paleontological view, is that they had tiny hands, with only 2 fingers, and they really weren't that successful. They were egg stealers, and they were, and they were parasites, and they were scavengers, and they were opportunists, and many of the giant dinosaurs were living on the last of what was an explosion of life, an explosion of botany. And so they grew because they were like 2% that owns 85% of the wealth. So they were the 2% that we can see. Like, so in the fossil record, you see the big bones and what survives. But what you don't see is the 99% of all other reptile and saurid and dinosaur life, that didn't survive, that was being killed off.
Yeah.
These percenters were taking all of the sustainable, that they were not living within a symbiotic relationship with all other life at that time, and they were just basically eating everything. And so the metaphor is the same, so Trump becomes that, that T-Rex, but there were other things that were trying to come forward. And so there were forms of life that were moving forward but were like in the ocean. And so you look at those things, and so they have their Obamas, but their Obamas become crushed by the giants, and so they become the exception, not the rule. And if there are 50 more Obamas, we'll all of a sudden say, well, he was the first, But right now, he just basically is the exception to the rule.
Right.
And Trump, sadly, is much more closer in terms of his beliefs to George Washington and Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson than Obama is. Like those guys were slaveholders and rapists and killers and and all kinds of things. But we've rewritten history to understand them differently. And so while Obama lives up to their ideal, he's nothing like them. Trump is probably more like our founding fathers than any president in recent history. We were evolving through Trump, through all kinds of things and everything, up until Spanish flu, And we rose again, and we fucked up again now.
I wonder if T-Rex, I wonder if that's a product of marketing too. Like, I wonder if he looks terrifying. Like, maybe they weren't terrifying. Maybe we just think they are because of, like Don Knotts. Don Knotts was an incredible ladies' man. Nobody knew that because he didn't look like one, but he was a big womanizer. Well, maybe T-Rexes were just like really terrified all the time and like quivering. Maybe they were like the nicest guys in the neighborhood. Like, do you ever think about that? Like, you look at your dog, everybody looks at their dog and they always think, oh, like, I love my dog. It's so nice. Maybe to other dogs, your dog's an asshole. Like, I don't know. My dog can be an asshole. I don't know. He's nice to me, but I hate it.
We have all of these feral cats that come. So Kate is like the cat whisperer. And so we've given away like 10 cats in the last 2 years living here because the feral cat population is so crazy. So this last one, though, is like this mama cat comes up and she's like starving and really in bad shape. So Kate starts nursing her back to health, and all of a sudden she brings up her 3 kittens and her lover and her brother. And so it's like, but we're watching this little feral cat family, and so for the first time we get to see a mom being a mom in the wild, and essentially like they're learning how to be cats. And so we started to realize that because we rip cats away from their mom at like 4 weeks or whatever, they don't get any of that kind of a socialization. They don't imprint on us, and we're like, oh, cats are so cool because they're so, they're so aloof, and then they're all this stuff, and it's like, no, they have PTSD because you rip them away from their moms, and they don't know how to socialize, and they don't know what the hell they are, and all of this different stuff. And I really think that that's the same with human culture too. I think that we are several generations away from nuclear families and homogenous villages, and whether it was right or wrong, a belief in a way to do something. And so now we're in this chaos where everybody has been moved to the suburbs or to urban areas, and so all of our ideas around what culture is like, in many cases, like less than 50 years old. Like I live in the hood right now, and all of the guys who live here are Southern. And so they don't have a memory of food from the South. They don't have a memory of how to act. So what they call old heads. So I'm an old head here. And so all of the old guys here will call me Unc. They call Kate Miss Kate. And they have very Southern manners. But 2 generations down from that, they don't have any concept of culture or memory of how to act or what to eat or where they came from, because they were raised by mothers who were like 13, 15, 16 years old, who were also raised by mothers who were 13, 14, 15, 16 years old, and no men. There's no men within the culture. And so you may have, like next door, one mom, 5 baby daddies, and 8 kids who all don't know how to act. They all feed themselves cereal, food. Their mom works all the time, and the only time you see people coming is when they try to steal their food stamps or something like that. So you have like 2 or 3 generations now that have no culture. And I think that's sort of
this is what I was talking today to Ann Mulder about this. We like to look at and think that this is.
I love her, by the way.
Yeah, I love her too. She's an amazing person. But the thing is, we like to look at this and think of, we think in terms of race and we think in terms of culture, and that isn't irrelevant at all. This is all class. This is class struggle. I mean, it's what happens with poverty. This is what it is. And that is the great battle. I mean, we keep looking at racism as if it's a thing unto itself, and it isn't. Racism is a symptom of classism. Right. That's what it is, And what we need to do is tackle that first. And that's what so many people, and especially Americans, are so, like lately I've been reading a lot about Italy and France in the 60s. And it was very interesting because they had as much, if not more, upheaval than we had. We never talk about it. Like I thought it was so fascinating. They were talking about, I watched this thing about the moon landing that was really wonderful, that 3-part series about the moon landing, but they were talking to Borman, one of the guys who was one of the astronauts, and he was talking about his European tour. And he said, we went to France and it was so much nicer than America. He said, in America, their campuses were all torn up by unrest and all they were protesting. But in France, everybody was so nice to us. And he was in France in 1968. I said, are you kidding me? Paris' streets were all barricaded in 1968. They just didn't take you there, It wasn't that the country wasn't in flames. It was that you didn't see it. But the thing that was interesting is that we became about our protests all became about two things: Vietnam or civil rights. That's all they became about, right? Well, both Vietnam and civil rights are only symptoms of class struggle. And that's what the unrest in Europe and France and Italy was about. It was about classism,
Right.
you know? It was about building an equitable social system, you know? And we never tackled that. We are so easy to distract. It's like a bunch of trout. You just shine something in front of our face. You know, here's Vietnam, and all of a sudden we all forget. You know, this guy's making 100,000 times more than his workers are. You know, we're not going to give anybody $12. It's outrageous to give somebody $15 an hour, but we've got more billionaires right now than we've ever had on the planet. You know, this is the battle. This is the battle. It's so hard, and it shouldn't.
I think it shouldn't be, because it's tied to the inequity of both race and gender, and so race and gender becomes a class unto itself, you know. And so if you find a country, you know, it's like, this is like 100 years after the advent of slavery and colonialism, is that you're still defining Black people as only 3/5 of a human being, and you're defining women also at some unknown fraction. You know, it's like probably 77% at that time, just like their wage disparity is now. You know, is that those things are based upon markers that are easy for people to discriminate against. You have 2 chromosomes, you have melanin.
Yeah.
So the ability to pass into those upper echelons are slowly changing, but it's not a revolution. You know, we think about the 60s as a revolution, but you know, Bernie Sanders was screaming in the 70s about things that were already 20 years old, and now 40 years later, you know, 50 years later, young people are saying, well, we want our revolution. And it's like, that revolution that you think you're joining is half a century old, and the thing it represents, the suffrage of women, the suffering of slavery, that's 400 years old, and then 5,000 years old if you want to go to that. But the only reason it becomes about race and sex is because those are easy markers for us to understand.
Right.
When it used to be about, am I Polish or Lithuanian? Am I Christian or am I Catholic? You know, and those ways homogenize better. But here, you know, like in Grand Rapids, you still see there is a west side and there is, you know, an east side. There is a sharp division between the Polish people and the Lithuanians in the west side. There is huge differentiation between people who consider themselves Latinx, you know, or Latinx, and people who consider themselves Mexican. You know, like you can be Latino and be ethnically Black, or you can be Spanish and white, Cuba, and wealthy. You know, again, the distinction is not racial, or it's not even religious, purely on class. And class very often is about what you can pass as. You know, so people wonder why Latino people can vote 35% for Trump. You know, well, they don't consider themselves Hispanic or Mexican, whatever. They consider themselves white. They consider themselves wealthy, and those two things are what they want to protect. You know, it's like my parents totally believed in belonging to the caste that you could most get away with.
Yeah.
You know, so in many senses, like my dad was because we come from a racist culture too, but it's the Chinese that were the racists. So the Hindu culture and the Arabic culture and the Chinese culture all were at the top of the caste. So my dad, who was Mandarin, considered himself, you know, what they call and the highest caste, and he despised all Chinese people who were trying to pass as Mandarin more than anybody else. And my mom's family was at the bottom of that thing, so she was a mixed blood and couldn't pass, and so um, she was born blonde, and so her father was a soldier in a POW camp, and so her mother had to like sell her into slavery because they couldn't walk around with a blonde kid, uh, and 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 she was a sold slave as a good luck in couples, and it was because she was a second daughter, and that's a function of class too. Like if you had a third daughter, you could get rid of the second one. You could legally kill her, or you could sell her. That seemed like the better thing to do, and so that's how they rationally. But we're not really that far removed from this culture.
No.
We have class markers, but since we're so homogenized, it's easier to pick on the big ones, because we have 400 years of slavery and 5,000 years of misogyny, and Trump is the T-Rex of all of that.
Right now.
But I don't think that it's easy to make that right. I think that you have to take people where they are and what they believe and how they relate to whatever it is that is their personal view of themselves within. You familiar with the persecutor triangle? Like there are persecutors and there are victims and there are rescuers. And so Jungians and psychoanalysts use this and all kinds of different people. But the idea is that self-identification is very often classified or put into caste because of this thing. Am I of the rescuer class? Am I of the persecutor class? Am I of the victim class? And I think that we identify cultures and colors and sex based upon those value systems that are pretty much primal, So T-Rex, Trump is a persecutor, views himself as a victim, and he's not a rescuer. And so the victims turn out to be the rescuers in this situation. But that sort of weird identification is what evolves politics, it's what evolves religion, what evolves our own psychologies about ourselves. It's like the differentiation within Maslow's hierarchy is like that thing in our head that views ourselves as a victim or not, or as a persecutor. Sometimes we think being a colonialist or triumphant or a winner is our ability to persecute others because we don't want to be a victim.
Yeah.
And I think Trump's own psychology and narcissism is based around that.
Yeah.
He totally sees himself as a victim.
Well, I think I think you're right. But that's what I think is what's really interesting about him, the only thing that's interesting about him, I find him mostly just really boring, like this is why I don't watch him ever. I never watch him because he's boring. But the thing is that, when you were talking about those things, victim, persecutor, rescuer, I think most people see themselves, all three of those things at different times, in their lives. They can see themselves as different things, But I truly don't believe this man has normal instincts. I don't think he has normal human instincts. I don't think he has a normal human personality. I don't think he really understands any of those roles, really. I think he only understands how to profit from any of these things or how to advance from it. He's just different than all of us. He's different. It's interesting to me because like you get in these these arguments, like people want to put a label on somebody, you're this one thing, and so like it's so funny if I get into an argument on Facebook with like a Trump guy, they'll immediately start talking to me like I'm a baby. They'll start going, oh, what do you need your safe space, tree hugger, snowflake, all of that, And I thought, you don't understand liberals, do you? At all. I will come and burn down your house with your kids in it, and I won't care. I won't shed a tear. It's like we're the guys who, in the Soviet Union, we're the ones who didn't care what happened afterwards. After you shot. That's why, like, people used to say to me, why don't you run for this office? I thought I would be the absolute worst person in the world to put in charge of anything. I'm terrible. I'm such a reactionary. I would be awful. I'd be just awful. I mean, it's like, and we build these cultures around them. It's like Che Guevara. We talk about Che Guevara. There's a big idol for people, right? And there was a side of Che Guevara that was wonderful. He was also a cold-blooded murderer. I mean, during the murdering squads in Cuba, he was in charge of all that. And nobody's just one thing. It's again, it's marketing. It's easier to sell a story if you could say this is the bad guy, this is the good guy. But what's interesting about this is that Trump doesn't fit those roles. He isn't good guy or bad guy because he's psychotic. Like, where do you put that? Where do you put that? Yeah. Isn't it interesting? It was like I was talking today about this thing about that he probably said about the military. It's interesting because even the people who defend him, the only reason the way they defend him is by saying, I never heard it. They're not saying it wasn't possible that he said it, or it isn't possible that he believes it. And the thing is, that's his followers are the same way. They know he's capable of that belief. They know that even if he didn't say it, he might think that way. Because I really think what he does is, I think there are people who see themselves as evil or as bad. They know they're bad. They know they don't fit in society. And I think he validates them. He validates them. Yeah. He makes them visible, And that's why you see all the KKK coming out from under their rocks and all that kind of stuff. Because for years they've known that they're scum. They know they're wrong. They don't think they're right. But what they needed is for someone to say, it's okay, you can walk in the sun. And that's what he does. Which is an interesting thing, isn't it? It's fascinating. Yeah.
Well, I think and I think that Che is a really good example of that. But I think that this is a cyclical thing, and so the rise of the KKK in Reconstruction and the rise of the KKK in the 1920s, it's like up until last week, the biggest number of shares I had was showing 15,000 KKK in Grand Rapids in 1925, marching up Bridge Street, like right in front of the El Sombrero, and all in the roads and everything. And so what was fascinating at the time is that the papers didn't say anything about it. It was not mentioned in either of the three newspapers of the time. And we know about it because some of the church bulletins and the church, different churches talked about it, and the Catholics talked about it on the West Side because they came to terrorize the Polish and the Lithuanians on the West Side. They crossed the river and they walked into the Black community and came and marched in front of the Baptist Church, the AME Church, and the other church. They went back up and they camped at John Ball Park Zoo. So 15,000 KKK families camping at the zoo, and that was way out in the open. That's far beyond where we are right now, and we saw the same things at Reconstruction. So those things that he's saying and doing right now were at the beginning of what I'm fascinated by 1933 Germany. It's like they were all saying that what Hitler was doing was part of the democratic process and the evolution of the Germans after World War I and things, and an answer to the Spanish flu and an answer to the monarchy's inability to deal with shit. But we saw the same thing in the United States at the same time. Our reaction was the same thing, so like if 1920 is the beginning of the Nazi Party. 1920 is also the beginning of the KKK, and they were similar movements. You know, they're rooted in nationalism. They took on the ideas of goodness and socialism. You know,
Right,
or what it was called at that time.
but add into that 1917 was the
Yeah.
Workers' Revolution, the worldwide
Yes.
Workers' Revolution, and then
Yes.
1927 was really the beginning of the solidification of the Soviet Union,
Mhm.
right? So, like, you can look at these movements in Germany with the Nazi Party, and in the American South with the KKK, and again relate these to classism, because you had the Wall Street
Yes.
bombing. What year was the Wall Street bombing? Was that 1924? I don't remember the big Wall Street bombing. I mean, we don't even talk about that, where they blew up Wall Street. Hundreds of people were killed, you know, and that was a workers' revolution.
Yeah.
Those were workers'
Yeah.
parties that did that. Plus, you had things like Ludlow, you know, in Colorado, right?
Yeah.
So you have this massive. If you look at these movements, I mean, like, I'll bet, and I haven't done it, you know, but I'll bet that I could relate the rise of the KKK to anti-communism, because I think that was the real battle. You know, that's the real battle, is that you have the ruling class, and they're terrified of that. I mean, the Soviet Revolution must have been terrifying in the United States, especially during the Depression. I mean, you look at Grapes of Wrath, you know, it's like, it's so funny. The first time I went to a Writers Guild meeting, the first time I went, I heard these guys talking, and I thought, well, God, no wonder they thought you were all commies, because you all are. You know, it's like everybody there was talking like that. And if you look at all of those movies from the 30s, it was fascinating me the other day. I was watching Meet John Doe, okay? And here's a movie by Frank Capra that stars Gary Cooper and Barbara Stanwyck, right? And those three people were all very active in persecuting the socialists in Hollywood during the Red Scare. All three of them were they were part of that American Defamation League, Anti-Defamation League, and they were naming names and giving witnesses, right? You know, and that movie, all of those Capra movies are love letters to socialism. Like, how do you reconcile that? How are you Frank Capra? How do you wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to turn in a socialist and I'm going to make me John Doe? You know, I mean, I don't understand how you do that.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting. Yeah.
But I think that, and I also think that our perceptions of those things and our memory of those times and people are colored by the outcomes. You know, I think that at the time, it was easy to understand the rise of nationalism because you just got through, you know, the World War I and the recession of the time and the Spanish flu and the disintegration of the government's inability to deal with those things. I mean, we don't know too much about the Spanish flu because the president never mentioned it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they totally ignored a major extinction event that was worldwide, millions of people dying and stuff. And I think that when we look at the Reconstruction, and if you don't see that the pandemic of times that was literally in New Orleans, 3 huge pandemics that during the period of Reconstruction, they called New Orleans Necropolis because there were so many above ground cemeteries and so many people dying, like 1 out of 10, 1 out of 5. And at one point, 25% of the population were all dying. That the people who suffered from those pandemics were the people at the bottom of the food chain. It was a class thing. And now we villainize those people. And I think Che and what's the other dude? Oh man, I forget his name now.
Who's that?
But Che Guevara, the other revolutionary, besides Che, from that same period of time.
Well, not
South
Castro.
American. They knew each other.
You're not talking about Castro, right?
No,
You know,
not.
Castro.
We're talking about
Che Guevara.
there's another besides Che. Anyway, so those guys within the context of class were folk heroes. They were Robin Hood heroes. They were, like those kinds of things. And so our visions of them are colored by, because they were by no means like philanthropic nice guys or anything like that, but who they were and what they were fighting for is much more like Robin Hood than terrorism, and that's a whole other story too. So like you're talking about Che Guevara, I used to be in the sweat lodge with Akasida, which is a warrior society, and so my eagle feather comes from giving the warrior societies the ability to lead sweat lodges in the VA and in the prison system. So basically, what I did is that I created this fake religion, and so I'm registered as a peyote, um, priest, and so I created a fake religion and created all the paperwork they needed to practice in the VA and to run sweat lodges and in the prisons, right? And so then I got other people who were recognized. Clarissa Pincola Estes was one of the signatories. So we created this fake religion so that they could go and practice in there. And so I was like really popular with the Akasida, um, and they sweat with them. So they were like all of these old veterans and all of these old medicine men and stuff. And they had all been at Wounded Knee and they all knew all of this stuff. And so I come in one day and I have my Che t-shirt on, right? That iconic screen print halftone of Che, and it just says Che underneath. And they're like, "Oh my God, who is this? That's the greatest t-shirt in the world!" And they're all pointing at it, laughing at it. So in Lakota culture, when somebody says, "I like your t-shirt," you have to take it off, right? You give it to them. If they say they like something, so this guy gives me this buck knife, and he goes, beautiful ear antler buck knife and hand forged and everything. And I thought, well, that's a good trade. And there's like, so tell us about this Che. And they all bust out laughing. And they're like, so was Che a big man or was Che? And so they're talking about Che. So I'm giving them this lecture about what a warrior Che was and how he was so misunderstood and how he was like for his people, whatever. And they all start, they all take out their knives and they're all yelling, Che, Che, Che. And so the guy who gives me this knife, he says, from now on, you are Che Gleshka to us. And that's your name, so we give you your warrior name now. And so the next time I came back, I brought them all Che t-shirts. And they're in hysterics. They're all wearing these shirts. And they're all like walking around, and so Dave American Horse, so he's American Horse's grandson, comes up to me and he says, in our language, Che means penis. And he says, Che Gleshka means little penis. So they're all calling you little penis and walking around with their Che shirts because they don't give a shit about what kind of a warrior he was. Che means penis. They think this is the funniest thing in the world, So I have this picture of all of these old guys walking around with their fingers.
Yeah. We always joke.
What's that?
Well, it's interesting because years ago, I remember I was wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt in Venice. And a guy came up to me and he said, I understand that that's just a t-shirt to you and that you're wearing his image. But he said, to me, he murdered half my family, and you go, oh, okay. And I understand, it's both things, but it's interesting. Again, it's marketing. It's like you just mentioned Robin Hood, we have the Robin Hood legend, right? I always think about this, that the good guy in the Robin Hood legend is Richard Lionheart, right? He's protecting Richard.
Yeah.
And Richard is Sean Connery, who comes in the end, he's always the regal guy. I'm here to protect you guys, Richard was a horrible guy. Richard the Lionheart was a horrible guy.
Yeah.
He never lived in England. He never even spoke English. He only spoke French, and he only came to England to tax people so he could go and kill Arabs. And he would slaughter Jews on the way, right?
Yeah.
What we hate in that story is Prince John, right? Well, it's Prince John who brings in Magna Carta,
Yeah.
who brings in representation of the working
Yeah.
man. You know, he's the bad guy in that story.
Right.
Isn't that interesting? You know, isn't that
Yeah,
interesting? I don't know. But again,
My
it's
my son.
like you look at Castro. I remember Evan got really angry with me when Castro died, and I did a post where I just said, you know, he was really amazing. He outlived all of his enemies. I mean, you know, it was, and he thought I was. He thought I was saying he was a good guy. I know that Castro wasn't a good guy, you know, but I also know that Batista was not a good guy, right?
Yeah.
And I know that there's this population of Cuba that loved Cuba before Castro, and there's a large population that loved Cuba after Castro, and there are people who hated both, you know. So I don't know, you know, it's really interesting, these things. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how history judges him. You know, I don't know. He was I think he was certainly probably the most interesting character in my lifetime. He must have been one of the most, at least, you know. Gosh. But
My son is a big game, you know, video game player or whatever, and so I talked to him about our family history. My grandfather was called the Yao Tang, and they believed that he was the lineal descendant of the emperor, and and that was so long ago, but that someday they would return, and they would rule China again, and so um, um, so that's where my name comes from, and so my my grandfather's name was Yao Pi Chin, and so you put the last name first. But Chin was also the clan that he belonged to, through a political bringing together of different families, and so he was the highest-ranking Chinese person in Indonesia, um, and had a military rank from the Dutch government, and they formed an army based upon the idea that they were going to take China back again, you know. And so the Chinese people, the Mandarins in Indonesia, truly believed that he was the Yao Tang. He was the rightful ruler, and the second son of the Dragon Emperor. And so my son, we're driving, you know, yesterday from the beach, and he starts looking this up, and he was saying, "Oh, I found our ancestor," or whatever. He starts telling me this amazing story about the Dragon Emperor and how his first son was shunted aside and put on the southern borders of China, while the other sons all fought to become the next emperor and pushed aside. And that he was then taken, and when the emperor died, the brothers come and say, well, we're taking over, and dad signed this will, and they falsified all of this thing, and basically they force him to commit suicide, and his son then exiles and runs away to Indonesia. So I said, well, this is then the same story that we've always been told in my family. He said, when did this happen? He goes, 250 BCE. So this is a story that's been in my family for like 2,000 years, and they still believe it to this day. Like someday the Yao Tang, the oldest son of the oldest son of the oldest son, will take his rightful place. And their alliance with the Dutch government was largely based on an alliance to create this army. So my grandfather's name was a title was Mayor de Chinese, which means the major of all of the Chinese. And he married my grandmother, whose father was the Captain de Chinese, the captain of all of the Chinese. And so they had this huge Chinese army, and their idea was they were going to go back into China and rescue it from communism. And so they thought the revolution was their big chance. And so till the day he died, and to this day, those titles all exist because the alliance with the Dutch was going to like take everything back. What's fascinating to me is that my son knows all of these Japanese and Chinese video games and anime and manga, where this particular character, whose name is Fuso, is the hero of Japanese and Chinese cultures, because he's the rightful heir who was pushed aside or whatever. And so this is a really, really famous and popular character within Chinese culture right now, because there's this sort of resurgence of wanting to go back to having an emperor or whatever, and everybody identifies with this one guy as the rightful Chinese emperor. And so my son thinks it's great that he's a descendant of Fuso, but then that makes well, would that make me the emperor? And I'm like, no, I said, I'm the second son. I said, second sons suck in our culture. And my brother is the first son. So, Jim. And so I said, and so essentially you have to kill him and your cousin in order for me to become emperor. And he goes, I could do that. But it's fascinating to me that, first of all, in Chinese culture, for all of these years, and even through the revolution, he was the bad guy. He deserved to be exiled. And now it's been changed around. And it's like, if he had been, because it turned out that the first Dragon Emperor was this horrible guy who, denying the yellow fever was a pandemic, who was taking all the money of the former Chinese empire and creating Peking and the palaces and taking all of the gold, and he was taking and going and using his armies to go and gather women from every province so he could have the most by the most different languages and colors or whatever. So he was this horrible guy, and his son Fuso, was his job to reform China. When he took over, all of these practices would stop. He would unite China. They would all stop fighting each other, all this stuff. And for that, he was exiled. And now, even through the Mao Revolution, he was a bad guy. Now he's this huge hero, and they've reinvented him. Because
but this happens. I mean, go on your face.
Like Trump.
Say that again when you pause there. What?
I said so the whole story has changed because the Dragon Emperor, who was a god and a figure god, even within the Maoist revolution, because Mao himself was a Mandarin, all of a sudden they're realizing that the original Dragon Emperor was Trump, and they see him as all that is wrong with China now. That all of the amount of wealth that has left the villages and the destruction of the revolution and everything, and the destruction of communism itself, is because the wrong dude, the second son, took the and now he's a hero again. And so we're looking forward to running.
Go on your Facebook wall and see how many of your liberal Democrat friends are deifying John McCain right now.
No.
Well, they're all saying, "Oh, you called John McCain a loser." I'm thinking, "Oh man, you should have heard the news I called John McCain." I mean, it changes now by the minute. I have to check the news every morning to see what I believe in. It all depends. Is the enemy of my enemy is my friend? I don't know. Trump comes out tomorrow. And
I don't know if you.
Yeah.
I had a post go viral last week, and it was just one of those smart-assy things that I write, and not really good or funny or better than any other one. But within 24 hours, I went back and it had like 8,000 shares. Okay.
Right.
So all of this is like analytics based. It's not like all my friends thought you're brilliant or whatever, because all of the other smart assy shit on the either side says one share, no shares, whatever. Somebody grabbed this and amped it up and boosted it and did it to create controversy. But the ironic thing was that I got hundreds of friend requests, but I also got like lots and lots of direct messages because I ignored the whole thing. It's happened to me before. But people were direct messaging me. And what happened was that more than any other thing, women who identified as social justice warriors, almost invariably educated white women, would write to me to demand that I'm telling lies, that I'm creating disinformation, and that this is fake news, and that I am a Trump supporter, and that I mean, it's just like, and I looked at it and I went onto my Facebook and I started looking at all of the shares and reading some threads, and there was this huge war between the far right and the far left, and I become the devil in the middle of all of this. And so I get all of these posts, and they're almost all the same. They all are misspelled. They all say the same thing, that I'm a fake news. I'm sowing discord. I'm sowing disinformation, whatever, as if they're all writing from a script. Turns out that they are. Is that in the same way that the Russians and Trump use analytics on the right, these people are using analytics on the left to incite social justice warriors and dissuade them from voting Democratic. At the same time, other people are pumping up my shares because they are trying to dissuade people in the center from voting for Trump. And so I become the enemy of the far left and from the moderates who want people to leave the Trumpian world, and they're using what I write or what I wrote for their own purposes, and they amp it up. And so I'd like to think that I'm like share worthy and that I'm an influencer and that I have 8,000 shares in 24 hours, but it's totally artificial. It's totally created to create whatever image of me or Jacob Blake or Kyle, I forget his name, that they want to their own end. And so they're all using this same meme, and there's nothing particularly clever or controversial about it. They just decided, you know. And in the midst of that, whether you're on the right or the left, I'm still the devil, you know. But I don't even read these messages anymore because I've got 100 of them parked on people trying to get onto my messenger, you know. But most of them are female white social justice warriors, and they're all telling me. I've been told this week that I'm not black enough to support Black Lives Matter. This is one that I've gotten a lot, is that I have not lived the black experience and so cannot speak for it. And when I pressed them on what that is, you know, and one person says, "You're far too erudite to be black." And I'm like, "You're a social justice warrior. You just said the most racist thing, you know, that you possibly could." But one guy finally just came right out and said, "Well, you obviously grew up privileged, so you have no right to say this stuff." And I said, "Well, I grew up in the projects, you know, I was homeless and whatever." And he said, "You're a liar, fake news." And then I was blocked, you know. So it's a weird world, you know.
Yeah.
But I am little.
Wait,
Someday they'll be wearing my face on a t-shirt. What's that?
you're dropping out. What did you say?
Oh, I said I'm little Che. So, so someday they'll
okay.
be wearing my t-shirt. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I'll wear that T-shirt.
Except it won't have my face. It'll have a penis. It'll have a little penis in halftones. You know.
You know the story I loved. I love this story that Vacarro one time when he and Mary were married, he went
Yeah.
to Japan, and he was wearing one of Mary's T-shirts, and that's when Mary was a midwife, and it had the Japanese symbol for midwife on it. And he was walking down the street, and these two guys came up to him, and they said, "Do you know what that symbol means?" And he said, "Yeah, it means midwife." And they looked at him a second, then they went, "Oh, yeah, it could mean that." And they walked away. And he said he took the T-shirt off and never wore it again. That's really funny. That's hilarious. Yeah.
Midwife probably is second wife. That's the second wife's job to birth the baby.
Right.
So he's walking around. He's a concubine or something. He's like Mark,
I found this interesting. Like it says
whatever
it says there are 15 people here, and it's been that all the way through. Are there 15 people watching this? Do you know?
I don't believe so. I think that a lot of people reserve this so that they can watch it whenever they want to watch.
Oh, I see. So these are not people. Like I see Nancy Gallardo is here.
Yeah.
I love Nancy and Terp and Terry. Yeah, they're just wonderful. Yeah. But I'm on here, and I'm certainly not watching.
Yeah, you're here, and so you like you. And so, but I think that what I noticed, not just this one, I do other crowdcasts, is that people reserve that watch it whenever they want. They're like, we're like streaming now, It's like somebody will binge watch all of these. Like 3 years from now, they'll watch 30 My Dinner Withs all in a row and try to discern what the thread is that holds all of this together. And part of it is that I'm too cheap to go to restaurants and too scared to go out in public, And I think that's my whole motivation.
That's funny.
And so I think some people have rented My Dinner with Andre, and they've watched My Dinner with Andre, and so their expectations of our conversations are really high, and so we have to throw in all kinds of Russian and all kinds of conspiratorial things, and what we have to say has to be prophetic. But I believe it is. I believe that nobody will know how brilliant dinner was until 20 years from now.
Right.
And I'll be Wally Shawn. And he'll be Andrew.
I have to say, I watched that movie not too long ago, and it's magnificent. It's magnificent. It is so thrilling, to watch that movie. It's just, but both of those guys, I mean, they really are two of the greatest minds of my lifetime. Andre Gregory was amazing. And Wally Shawn is brilliant. His father was too, his father was, right? So he was amazing guy. Yeah. So good.
But he'll always be in the Princess Bride. I always think of him in the Woody Allen movie where she keeps talking about her ex-husband. Yeah, it's in like Manhattan. He's this sex god, and he's
in Manhattan,
and it turns out to be Wally Shawn.
That's hilarious.
That's Manhattan.
Hilarious
Which is
it is.
My favorite Woody Allen movie is and so I identify with him. I have that same voice too. So I'm trying to develop a better lisp, but most people see him as a comic figure.
Yeah.
I'd
love to see him. He does plays, and I know he both writes and acts in plays. And I'd love to see him on stage. I wonder what he's like on stage. Yeah. I saw Henry Fonda.
So somebody,
and he was magnificent.
Somebody said he used to do these monologues where he just gets and sits up on stage and sits on a bar stool and just talks whatever comes to his mind, and that musicians like Woody Allen and other musicians would just play music behind him. He would just say stuff. I didn't understand most of My Dinner with Andre when I watched. I've had to watch it over and over again as the years go by, and I know more stuff. But now it does seem prophetic. I don't think that people will watch this and think it was prophetic, but maybe. I mean, we don't know how
Well, you know,
We
the
are.
thing about
I think
that
they
movie,
probably just thought we were.
yeah, the thing about that movie that's interesting is that, you know, movies are all about structure. Like we haven't really talked about movies. That's interesting. We've been on for a
Right.
while. We talk about it, but screenplay writing, you know, it's not like other forms of writing. It's a very specific kind of writing, and it's more like being a draftsman than being a painter. Okay, because it's really about
Right.
structure. It's about structure, and you can sort of learn structure, but you have to kind of feel structure. You know, you have to be able to feel it. And I mean, there are just parts of that that sound kind of airy fairy, but they're true. I mean, like Neil Simon used to talk about how he could look at a page and say that it's wrong just by the way it looked. And sometimes without reading the words, and sometimes you can do that.
Right.
But structure is everything with movies. And the thing that's interesting is if you watch, like on My Dinner with Andre, and you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, it's basically the same movie. The beats are all in the same places, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so wonderful, is that it's this incredibly intellectual movie where they're talking about absolutely fascinating things. But the moments that raise you and the moments where you breathe are the same as if you were watching Star Wars. They're the same in every movie, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, you can move them around somewhat. Like, I always find Deer Hunter really interesting because Deer Hunter has like a 45-minute first act, and then it's got a 20-minute second act, and then it has a 50-minute third act, which is a really odd structure, you know? But the thing is, the beats are still basically in the same place, and that's what's important. Yeah, it's interesting.
I part of, you know, because I've been thinking a lot about this lately, is that our expectations around what, like, you know, you could not say, well, my movie is about two guys like talking to each other at dinner and that's it, you know. It's kind of like a Seinfeldian kind of a thing, you know, where it's like, well, this is not what a movie is, but it is more than anything. And I was thinking a lot about that because in my mind, I think of Obama's speech in 2004 as the best speech I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Better than all his later speeches, and also pure because he didn't have to do anything, prove anything. Inspiration, and it was like the highest oratory I'd ever heard. And I'd heard him speak at the Monterey defense dinner just a few months before that, and I thought he was brilliant then, but this was like mind-blowingly different, and he never actually lived up to that particular speech. And then the other day when Michelle Obama spoke, she gave what I thought was the best speech I'd ever heard at a convention, but it wasn't the same thing. It was like his was oratorical, it was speaking to an audience, it was exhorting delegates to do their job within a huge context and a huge oratorical fact that we think of as oration and stuff. And so here was this woman looking right at the camera, not the delegates, but looking right at me and talking in a conversational voice in the most authentic and real way. And all of a sudden, I realized that that conventions will never be the same after this. That the way we look at what's going on, that we no longer are allowed to abdicate our authority to delegates or to electors or to people that we say are whatever. And she and the writers and everybody who was putting this together understood that. They understood that there are no more, you know, like shamanism is dead. You know, the intercessor between your vote and your choices are now coming directly from people who understand that. So that becomes to me the best speech of not just the convention, but you know, the best speech of all conventions I've ever heard. And other people understood that at various levels and degrees, but also had different jobs. So Biden speak like that. You have to be oratorial and rhetorical and attack Trump. Obama himself gave a very professorial speech in a very academic setting, and also took the idea of what Kamala didn't have to do. So she did not have to be the attack dog, but he took that away. And he said, I'm going to speak to you like the adult in the room, and that's how you expect me to be, and I'm going to lay this out.
But that's
But
always
all of those things.
always been Barack Obama. I mean, I think that's always been Barack Obama.
Yes.
I mean, the thing that I found interesting about Barack Obama was that there was a sort of reverse racism with him, because I think that like liberals expected him to be a liberal because he's black. And the thing is, Barack Obama has never been anything other than a moderate. He has been a moderate his whole career. Yeah. And it's funny because the left sees him as not liberal enough, and the right sees him as too liberal. And the thing is, he's as moderate as any moderate we've ever had in that office. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I love the story about him that I love is in my life is that when the night he was elected, you know, it was so emotional for all of us. I mean, we were, you know, I was at a party in the hills, and it was all these liberals, and we were all sitting around. And when they announced that he had won, we were all crying and cheering. You know, a black man had won. And I remember we were up in this house in the hills, and it was this party, and I was sitting on the couch, and I looked next to me, and sitting next to me was Tony Dow. And I thought, this is like, you know, I've had a life that has been marked by surrealism, right? You know, but of all of those moments, this must be the most surreal, that I'm watching us elect the first Black American president. I'm sitting next to Wally Cleaver. You know, I mean, it was just such a weird moment. It was such a weird moment. But I think that, you know, this is what I sort of really like about Joe Biden. And I really do like Joe Biden. I've loved him as a candidate a number of times. I mean, he was a magnificent senator. He really was. And I mean, he was, you know, you have to look at it. It kills me right now because people talk about Joe Biden as if he crawled out of an egg 3 years ago. They don't know anything about him, you know? I mean, I was following Joe Biden in 1974. I remember that was the first time I really started reading about him. He'd only been a senator, I think, for a year, you know? And you get a sense of people when you follow them for that long. He's a great moderate. He's a great healer. Yeah. He's a great compromiser. And this is what we need right now. I mean, the biggest thing we need, and what he is in the biggest way, is he is empathetic. He feels. Yeah. This is a man who was
totally agree
to feel things, you know, and that is what we have a total absence of right now. We have a total absence of empathy. And so that's why I'm very excited about his candidacy. I'm very excited about him as president. He's wonderful.
Well,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, we got to wrap up in a second. These will only go 2 hours. But that was the very word that I found, and the fact that he is aimed his campaign at men. It's going to change everything, because I think that educated women and people of color are all going to come like they usually do, and Kamala Harris is great for that. But what we've been missing in the party is black men and white men, both voting at less than 20% of the population, and we can't win without that, you know. So, anyway, I got to wrap this up. 9:59, and I just love you so much.
It was like closing night. It was like 2 o'clock at the bar. The lights came on. I had to turn the lights on to get us to leave.
And so they're telling us to leave. And so, if you would, I would love to do this again. And
sure.
And then at that time, I will request my favorite stories. I want you to say them again. And we'll do part 2. But I've just enjoyed this so much. And,
me too. Well,
I love you.
We've had a long road. We've had a long road, you and I, and we've been a lot of things to each other. You know.
Yeah.
It's interesting because You were there also.
Yeah, yeah.
Betsy Howley, who I've been writing, a lot about lately, and Betsy is a dear friend too. And it's so interesting how so many people from that period of my life are still so close to me. And we've been so many, I mean, you and I have been so many things with each other. I was your teacher, and then we were friends. We've acted together. I directed you. We've written together. I mean, we've done so many things. It's interesting. Yeah. Long life. Good.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I thought about you because Betsy wrote what she just wrote, which I just think she's so brilliant, and
She's amazing.
And I don't even know what to say for what she writes. She's so amazing. But I think that what